Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, millions of Zimbabweans are dead and dying. Robert Mugabe engages in random acts of genocide against the Matabele people with alarming regularity. There is 95% unemployment. The life expectancy of Zimbabweans has gone down from 68 about 10 years ago to 37 now. There is barely any work, there is barely any land, and there is barely any food, and it is violent. Make no mistake, there is a civil war in Zimbabwe now. The difference is that in the status quo there's no one fighting for the people. They only have to face up to a crazed dictator who is not looking like he's stepping down anytime soon and has sufficient henchmen to continue his regime of horror and despair. I'm firstly going to talk about whether there are alternatives to invasion, which we do not think there are, and secondly, is civil war likely? So, alternatives. And this is the material that Tim and I brought you in our extension. Internal change that happens in an inexorable slow slide towards greater chaos is worse than anything we think will happen under our model, and I'll address that in my second area about the civil war. But turning back to the alternatives, we told you that fragmentation is worse because now every general has the time and the leisure to decide how he is going to position himself and take over power within the ZANU-PF. There is generalised war both within the ruling party and without. People who randomly get their hands on guns and see their opportunity. People who probably wouldn't do that if they were fighting against the army of South Africa, right? Take a seat. We also told you that there is a mad scramble for that power, and the issue is Robert Mugabe, to an extent, does feel some loyalty, some allegiance to the state of Zimbabwe. He has an international image to some extent, protect. He has, to some extent, present himself as the leader of Zimbabwe. When there are fragmented groups that are warring within themselves, there is not that sense of fealty, and so there is no check on their behaviour. There is no check on how many people they will kill. There is no check on how many farms they will requisition and how many guns they will steal. That's the problem. They don't have fidelity to territory, to a people, to a country, or to a profile, which Mugabe, to a small extent but an important extent, still does. They also said, and this got no response from this side of the House, that the status quo that we're engaging in of sanctions radicalises the population against us and makes it more likely that if and when something happens, they're even less amenable to Western intervention, to Western help, and to Western arms or boots on the ground, and we think that is a bad thing. Tim gave me the example of Iraq, and there was little attention, indeed no attention paid to that by this side of the House. They gave us the example of Cambodia. Of Indonesia. I would just dispute that was like a bloodless takeover. Thousands of people were killed, were fled from their homes, and ended up as refugees or internally displaced persons. Also, in Cambodia, there was a long period, 5 years in fact, of warring before Vietnam came in and swiftly took over, which isn't to defend the virtue of that invasion, but it is to indicate that that kind of invasion can quell and prevent messier, more chaotic internal tension. We then had, as another arm of our extension, which got no attention from that side of the House, that this encourages this side of the House's shining light of democracy, the DRC, to turn to more violent mechanisms, because they see no possibility of change, because they see no possibility of their ministers stopping being taken off the streets and beaten systematically. Why is it? So we think that they'll probably turn to violence, or parts of the DRC will turn to violence, like happened in the ANC when they splintered in the 70s, and like what we think will happen within the DRC. Why is that bad? It hurts them internally because the people who have an interest in the good governance of that state now no longer work with them. Secondly, they lose international support and standing, which means people are less likely to cooperate with them from outside, give them money and give them advice as to how to govern. This side of the House says, well, if the DRC did that, it would ruin their profile with the population. First of all, to an extent, some people will just become power hungry in that circumstance and won't care about the profile of the population. But also, Morgan Tsvangirai has called for a version of that policy already, and that hasn't reduced the roughly 80% support rate that he has amongst the Zimbabwean people. We also think that once you start getting food aid in after our invasion, once you start getting an economy again, that will probably make people well disposed towards the DRC. So, second part of this alternatives argument. This side of the House said, we'll just let him live out his days, no worries. He has said he will run for the 2013 election. First of all, we also think that the ZANU-PF party will continue to run Zimbabwe. Why? Because he told you they're non-ideological. He has plenty of people who he can pass this down to. They have absolutely no kind of compulsion under their model or under what they're proposing proposing to change. Why? Because they control the judiciary and the military and the national budget such as it is. So they have no good reason to look for the alliance that this side of the House thought was coming. No good reason. Finally, we think that harsher sanctions are actually worse because this side of the House tacitly acknowledged that those harsher sanctions would take longer than our model, but it hurts the people that they thought they were defending in the process. The question we ask, guys, is when will that day come? It cannot come fast enough for Zimbabwe. Turning to this question of civil war, but before I do, I'll take anybody. Go.
Both senior leaders underneath the Gaborone said they're willing to work with the MDC in a transition. Why is that not a plausible way of getting the democratic change you want peacefully?
Well, first of all, we dispute the accuracy of that fact, number one. If that is so true, why have they been inexorably and firmly opposed to nearly everything they have tried, the DRC has tried to do in the power-sharing government? That strikes us then as disingenuous at best, false at worst. So, civil war, do they have the capacity? And this is where Tim and I actually brought you some facts in this debate. They have 4 tanks, right? Roughly 20,000 troops, most of which are poorly trained. South Africa alone has twice the manpower and 41 times the number of tanks. We like those odds, ladies and gentlemen. We then asked you, who will do the fighting? Probably not ZANU-PF, because they're not a party based on ideology. They're a party based on patronage, and they don't really care once that patronage is not forthcoming. The rates of support of ZANU-PF amongst the population are not compellingly high, and nowhere near as high as support is in Afghanistan and Iraq for, terrorist groups who operate there. So we would distinguish it from those circumstances in that way. This side of the House never gave us any kind of indication as to how bad the outcome of civil war was. And I refer you to my opening, which said, how much worse can it get? How much worse do you want it to get for the people? Want it to get for the people of Zimbabwe? They then said in Ben's speech at the beginning of this debate, the consequences of civil war could be dire. Infrastructure could be lost. You could encourage regional conflict, and you could still damage the long-term possibility of democracy. I would venture that all 3 of those things are true now, but with no real hope of any soon solution. Ladies and gentlemen, Zimbabwe and the deaths of its people and the